Welcome to this episode of my ongoing series about the 100 objects that tell the story of Summerhill School, its philosophy and values. Today's object is a stone. So I thought I'd just start, because I love Thomas Hardy, and in one of my other episodes I was slightly wrong. I said that Jude the Obscure starts with a young boy scaring crows from the farmer's crop with stones, but I reread it and he does he starts to scare the crows with stones, but he scared the crow, but he actually uses a device that makes a noise. He uses a clacker. And then the farmer, when he stops and he allows the crows to settle and start eating the farmer's seeds, the farmer comes along, catches him and beats him with the clacker. So it wasn't stones he was using. But anyway, I thought I'd start, because on his way, he just said goodbye. The boy, Jude, has just said goodbye to his schoolmaster. And his schoolmaster's going off to the city in the hope of going to university and studying. And he feels sorry. Both of them feel sorry, because Jude is a great learner and reader, and he can only go in the evening classes. So, and he's the only student that is really saying goodbye to the teacher as the teacher loads up the cart with his belongings. Anyway, soon after that he then goes to the field, and this is what Thomas Hardy describes. He says, "The fresh harrow lines seem to stretch like the channelings in a piece of new corduroy, lending a meanly utilitarian air to the expanse, taking away its gradations and depriving it of all history beyond that of the few recent months." So the newly ploughed fields like erase the history of what's gone on before. Though in every clod and stone there rarely lingered associations enough and to spare, echoes of songs from ancient harvest days, of spoken words and of sturdy deeds. Every inch of ground had been the site, first or last, of energy, gaiety, horseplay, bickerings, wariness. And he goes on. But I love that image of the landscape and the soil and the stones, sort of retaining a history of the human landscape, of the human events that went on with it. And this is where we begin, because we begin with the stones which like arrowheads. Yeah? So this is a lovely Paleolithic arrowhead made from flint. And there was a book which is called Days Before History. This is the book, Days Before History. It was written by someone called Harry R. Hall, who became the senior curator of the Egyptian Gallery in the British Museum. And he sort of took part in digs in Mesopotamia and in Egypt, and he wrote about the history. And Days Before History is an amazing book because it tells the story of some boys, and one of them goes to stay with his uncle, and his uncle has a book, and he reads to them the book, and the book is the story of Tig. And Tig is a Paleolithic, a Stone Age boy. And he reads the boys this, and they're really into it. And he reads it to them first because he shows them, he takes them to a hillside for a picnic. And he says, do you think you can find me where people lived on this hillside? So they have to have a look, and they find like a shed which is used by hunters or something, and he says no, and then they find another building. I think they find an old sort of something for a place for burning things like peat or something, and he says no, that's for too new. And then one of the boys guesses that there's these sort of holes in the ground, and these holes in the ground, the remains of Paleolithic huts. And this is where the story begins. And the uncle then goes on to say, well, if you're interested, I'll tell you the story behind the people who built the holes and why they built the holes. And he tells them this story, and then sort of every other chapter is the story, and then the boys discuss the story with the uncle. And the boys sort of make their own arrows and bows, and they make their own pottery, and so they sort of act out the life of Tig because of this book. Now this is quite fascinating, because in one way it mirrors one of A.S. Neil's books, like Last Man Alive and other books that Neil writes, where he sort of tells a story to the audience, and the audience sort of interrupt and feedback. So it's a similar style. Yeah, though the storyteller in this is as fictional as the boys he's telling it to. But the reason why I tell this book is because it's got about Tig learning how to make bows and arrows, learning how to make stone axes and stone arrowheads. And the boys sort of desperate to find arrowheads. And in the end, that they get given them as a gift. Now, the importance of this book is, well, firstly, he starts off by thanking someone called Professor J.J. Finlay. And if we look at Professor J.J. Finlay, he was a very important educationalist at the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s. He was a professor of education, and he wrote the curriculum, or contributed to the curriculum at King Alfred's School. So he was very much involved in progressive education and the idea of children learning through inquiry and by doing and through questioning. And King Alfred's School is also the school, the progressive school, that A.S. Neil taught at before setting up Summerhill, which is quite interesting. Yeah. So there's a link there. The other thing is, there was a school in Little Something, a village, sort of in the 1890s, where a woman called Harriet Finlay Johnson and her sister moved to the village as teachers, and they ran the local elementary school. And she starts off by using nature, Harriet Finlay Johnson. She takes the children on nature walks every day and uses nature and what they discover and what they look at and what they hear in order to do music and song and geography and history and all the subjects. So she sent it. And then one of the boys, they were, I think, looking at Ivanhoe, the story of Ivanhoe. One of her children says, "Oh, why don't we act it out? It's such a nice story." And they act it out, and Harriet Finlay Johnson thought, well, this is, she was very impressed by how engrossed the students were, and then she started using drama as the key method of the children learning. So the children would choose a subject, or with her help, a historical subject or any other subjects, and then they would have to do research. And the boys built their own bookcases for the library, which Harriet Finlay Johnson helped fill, so they had books that the children could research from. And the children would research from the books and create their own scripts, and then create a play. And the play wasn't for an audience, the play was for the children themselves and a method of learning. Yeah? And they really enthused them. And the children had to make props, and they'd have to make scenery and things like this. And one of those sort of immersive drama things was Tig. She had the book Days Before History, and they used that as a resource. And the children would built a hut, just as the one that Tig lived in, which would have been either partly a hole in the ground with a roof on, or for the winter. Or in the summer, they would go. The Paleolithic people would go up higher in the valley, and or to another valley, and buy the wood, and they have huts. Yeah. So the school children in Little Something Elementary School built huts. They made pottery, just as they do in the Days Before History, and they made stone tools. And they even created their own museum using these as exhibits, which is quite fascinating. So they lived the life in immersive drama of a Paleolithic person. Yeah. So, very important. And just to remind you that Harriet Finlay Johnson and Little Sompting were the inspiration for Edmund Holmes. He was the Chief Inspector of Schools at the time, and he got Harriet Finlay Johnson. He visited the school several times. They became friends, and he published a book based on her work. Well, 2 books based on her work, which became very important in the history of education. And she was also on the first County Education Advisory Board, where she shared her method of drama and nature walks as a way of teaching children. Or she actually believed that teachers and students should be comrades, that they should be learning together, and that she didn't believe in the authority of the teacher in terms of the power and role of the teacher to tell off the child or to beat the child, which was what was done at the time. She believed that learning was an enthusiastic activity, and if it was from the children, if the children decided and negotiated their learning, then there was no problem with behaviour and there was no problem with authority. And she you can read her books about her, and her books where she's basically saying that the teacher and child should work together in a sense as equals, which in 1890 is an incredibly progressive idea, though she is part of a whole community who don't necessarily know about each other, and they all come to meet in 1914 at a Montessori conference, and then they all create the New Ideals in Education conferences that go on from 1915 on to nearly 1940. Right, the other story with this Days Before History is this was the inspiration for a young teenager. I think he was either 11 or 12, and he was given the book, and he avidly read the book. And he was his parents were living in Africa, and he was living with they were studying a tribe. And he was allowed as a young boy to mix with the tribe, and he was learning. He taught the children of the tribe how to play football, and they were teaching him how they hunted and how they gathered food and prepared it and things. So he was an incredible background in terms of, and the way he walked would be the way that the tribe walked and things, and the way he spoke was influenced, and his whole way of learning was learning through the community that he was part of, and also the environment, the landscape. So, and part of this was that he wanted and started collecting all the flints he could find, all the stones he could find, and because he said these are the remains. These tell a story, just like Thomas Hardy said in Julius Obscure. These tell a story. They tell a story of Paleolithic, of the Stone Age, because these are axes or these are arrowheads. He didn't know whether they were or not, and luckily his father had a friend who was a professor and was linked to a museum to do with paleontology. And they talked about exhibits where the stones were exhibited, and this boy had this whole collection of stones, and he showed them to his professor, who was a friend of his parents, and the professor said, yes, some of these are arrowheads and some of these are actual Stone Age tools that were made, and the boy was very, very proud. And what inspired him to collect these stones and think of them as history and as the history of ancient human beings was this book. Was that he'd been given this book Days Before History, and he'd read it, and as a young 12-year-old or 11-year-old, he just saw all about him because of this book, the landscape that had been left behind by our ancient ancestors. And this boy was Louis Leakey, and he and his wife later on were to do excavations in Africa and in Olduvai Gorge, and were to discover the earliest fossils of our ancestors in the Rift Valley of Africa, and to provide evidence that our origins, the human origins, were from Africa, not from Europe or from East Asia, but from Africa. So I just think that the way Louis Leakey learnt as a child was through enthusiasm and through this book, which is all about children learning through play, but learning through the sense that they enjoy and find wonder in the world around them, and then they're motivated for the rest of their lives to follow that joy and that wonder. Anyway, and I just want to say that Louis Leakey also goes on after being an archaeologist and finding Homo habilis, I think it was, and other fossils that showed our ancestry, that he was a mentor to the great animal behaviour scientists Jane Goodall and Diane Fossey, because they wanted to find out about those animals that are our closest ancestors. Anyway, so that's the story of an 11-12-year-old boy and this book, Days Before History. Other stories to do with stones is Neil, and the famous story that everyone hears is that of Neil throwing stones out a window. Well, Neil didn't, in fact, but Neil tells the story that one of his children, who was new to Summerhill, was throwing stones at the window at the school. And Neil comes across him, and the boy stops and looks at him, and Neil sort of picks up a stone and says, "What are you doing?" And the boy says, "I'm throwing stones at the windows." And Neil says, "Well, why have you stopped?" And Neil tells the story as if he might have joined in with the boy throwing stones, but the story illustrates what Homer Lane, he learnt from Homer Lane and from his own natural instincts or ideas with children, is that you have to be on the side of the child. That's whether the child's stealing things or whether the child is throwing stones at windows. That if you're on the side of the child, that is the way to sort of gain access to the child, by empathising with them and showing that you empathise. And then you can form a relationship in which whatever behaviour they're doing, they start to understand that maybe there are other things that they can do. They start engaging and being a member of a community that you help to invite them into by saying, "Look, we're equals." This is what Homer Lane thought, and in fact this is what a number of people thought in terms of their attitude to the concept of young delinquents, to young people who were becoming brutalised through poverty and through violence. But if only we start empathising with them, then we can help to, in terms of reform them, but not in the sense that we're training them to be good, in the sense that they become aware of what it is to be a part of a community that respects them and their dignity. So that's Neil and throwing stones. There was a boy called Stephen who was at Summerhill School. Normally I don't mention names, so I apologise, but he was a new student, and his whole attitude to the meeting and the rules of Summerhill were that he was quite a sort of legalistic young man. He likes things to be sort of well defined and sort of black or white, in terms of no greys, no areas of sort of haziness. So there was a law at the time, and laws about stones change at Summerhill, but normally they're about you cannot throw stones at the buildings or near the buildings, because if you throw them near the buildings they might accidentally hit the buildings. So that's normally a law. And for some reason there was a law, I think because some instances on the pathway that went down to where the older children lived, it's called the carriage pathway, because where the older children lived used to be railway carriages. It's not anymore. But they used to be railway carriages. And so the carriage path, there was a law saying you cannot throw stones on the carriage path. Partly because, the carriage path is where people walk, and it's near buildings as well, so there's windows right next to the pathway. And this boy, he had seen someone in front of him pick up a stone, and he must have said to the boy, "Look, I'll bring you up if you throw that stone." And the boy threw the stone. So the meeting case opened in the meeting, and so Stephen put his hand up when the chair said, "It's your case," and he said, "I'm bringing up so-and-so for throwing a stone on the carriage path." And there was a silence, and then Because normally when people bring things up, there's an issue, like someone's been hurt, or it's like, okay, you're bringing up the action of throwing the stone. You're not bringing up that something was broken or someone was hurt. So there's a slight silence, and then someone puts their hand up and says, was the stone aimed at anyone? And Stephen says, no. He just threw a stone on the carriage path. And someone else put their hand up and said, well, was it near the windows? He said, no. But there's law that says you cannot throw stones on the carriage path. And there's a slight sort of gentle, humorous laughter at just the way he was using the law. And Ed Toll puts up their hand and says, look, I propose we drop this case because even though it is against our law, that's not the point of the law. The law's there to protect the buildings, the windows, and people. And if someone was nearby, then you've got a case. Or if it was near a window, then you've got a case. But you're saying that someone just threw a stone on the carriage path. And Stephen put his hand up and said, it's a law, and I'm bringing it up because he broke the law. And there was no one there. It was not near a window, but he broke the law because he threw a stone whilst he was on the carriage path. And it was proposed that the case be dropped. The chair took the proposal, because normally you do take it quite quickly, and unanimously, apart from one vote, the case was dropped. So it's interesting. There was a discussion then about the nature of law, and the fact that if it's written down on paper as a law, then can you just bring people up for breaking it, or is the law got a bigger meaning than that? Because the law is a simplification. And that boy learnt that our laws aren't legalistic. They're there for reasons. They're reasons of protection, reasons of protecting buildings or windows or people. So that's, I always thought that was an interesting story, where the democracy of Summerhill allows these explorations by adults and by children. Normally it's by adults, because normally the adults are the ones, when they first arrive, they don't understand the meeting, and they can be very legalistic, and they can be very moralistic, and think, well, stealing's wrong, name calling's wrong, and they tend not to talk about the effect of it and the consequences. They tend to say it's wrong, and therefore the person should be punished, and normally the community doesn't like that. But they don't say anything much. They may argue against it, but normally they sometimes just ignore it. Okay, can I say that the other things that we do with stones is we paint them, and here's a lovely stone painted at Summerhill of a tree on the grass, which is a fantastic image to do with nature, and Harriet Finlay Johnson would have loved this. So children paint stones for art. They also paint them for objects that they sell at the summer fete. So this one would have been painted, and I got it because I would have bought it at the summer fete, or it may have been a present to me by one of the students. Also, talking about arrowheads and arrows, so this is an arrow, which is what the boys in the story Days Before History, they're given at the end by their uncle. They're given one each that they can choose, and this is the kind of thing that Louis Leakey collected as a 12-year-old. Our students at Summerhill build and make bows and arrows, just as they do, in fact, in Days Before History. The boys make their bows and arrows, and they do at Summerhill, but they're not reenacting Paleolithic, but they are, and they make them, and they go into the woods and they practice. And there's laws again about not firing arrows at people. So I think that's the only law, and maybe also you can't not do it where near the house. You've got to do it in the woods or on the field, so it's away from where people might accidentally turn around the corner and poof, you're hit by an arrow. So that's some of my stories about stones and Summerhill. I'm going to end with one more story, and that is a story to do with me, and that I was teaching class 1, which is the youngest children 6 to 10, and I'm a biologist, and I love taking these children for walks around Summerhill and looking for things. So we were looking, for spiders, and a particular spider, an orange spider, that lives on the stones. So we were looking under stones, and we found woodlice, we found centipedes, we found millipedes. We find some lovely and little spiders and ants and things under the stones, and then we find the thing I'm looking for, which is this beautiful orange spider, and I sort of touch it with my finger, Yeah, and I'm telling them this is the one, and this is one of the only spiders that, in a sense, can pinch you. In terms of natural spiders doing that, apart from the water spider. And as I was saying this, spider pinched my finger, and it was latched onto the end of my finger. But I mean, it can't break the skin. I mean, it could just nearly break the skin. And I was a bit shocked by this, and the children laughed. And then we went into I put it into a little petri dish just to show them, so we could look at it under a microscope, a special microscope, in the classroom, and then we released it back under its stone. But as a result of this, we then acted out spontaneously. One of the children was the woodlouse under a table, and I was the spider, and so I had to hunt the woodlouse and catch her, and then using, because this spider, this orange spider, is a specialist spider. It's the only spider that can eat woodlice because its jaws are so far apart that they can actually go up, underneath the woodlice and on top, and then pierce the woodlice's exoskeleton. So it's specifically adapted to hunt for woodlice. So I tell this story and then we play it out. And it was just a natural thing, but it was very much what Harriet Finlay Johnson would have done in 1890. But I didn't even know of her then. So thank you for watching this episode, and I wish you luck in finding your stones and looking in your landscape for the history that is still there. Bye bye.